live. And it's setting up. Okay, redirect connecting to Facebook Live. Okay. All right, great. I think we're officially live here. We'll give folks a moment or two to get themselves ready for tonight's program. Let's see. I'm going to double check and make sure we actually are live because I never trust this. Done like 80 of these programs since the pandemic started, and let's make sure we are good to go.
I'm glad you're on the technical end.
Yeah, I've got the hard job tonight.
Yeah, you do. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Let's see. I think we. Yes, I see our smiling faces on the screen. So with that, I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's program. It is my great pleasure to introduce my good friend and just a phenomenal historian, John Rees. John has spent decades researching the lives and experiences of the ordinary men who fought in the American War for Independence. I know John's written, at least 50 articles by this point on everything from what the soldiers ate, what they carried, what they wore, how they fought, really examining every aspect of life in the Revolutionary War in great detail. And his latest work is a book, They Were Good Soldiers, which chronicles the experiences of African-American soldiers in the Continental Army. A subject that has not, in my opinion, been touched on enough, certainly an important part of the revolutionary story. So thank you so much, John, on behalf of the Virginia Piedmont Heritage Area and our partners with the Black History Committee of the Thomas Balch Library. Welcome to tonight's program, and thank you for being here.
Well, thanks a lot, Travis. I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm very happy to be here myself. We're going to go on a little bit of a wild ride because it is a big subject, but I hope you find something of interest in my presentation, and I'll bring in Virginians now and again too.
Okay, great. And just for everyone watching, if you do have questions, please go ahead, put them in the comments. We'll do our best to make sure we answer all the questions. And then after the program, I'm sure John and I will have a chance to take a look and get to anything that we haven't touched upon. But with that, I'll let you take over, John.
Okay, cool. In a relatively short time, I want to give some idea of African Americans' experiences as Continental soldiers. Along the way, I'll share the stories of several individuals, take a look at how soldiers of color were treated, and tie it all together with some insights into their numbers. And I'll close my presentation by reading the portion of the only known still existing letter written home by a Revolutionary Black soldier to his wife. Now, before I go into the main portion of my talk, I want to mention two of the three largely all-Black regiments that served in the War of the Revolution. I'll speak about the third later, and that was the Segregated American 1st Rhode Island Regiment. Let's see if we can get some pictures on here. Let's see. There we go. Cool. Okay.
All right. I am not seeing the pictures.
No, let's see. Let's see. There we go. There we go. How's that?
Ah, great. All right.
There we go. This is actually a painting based on an actual incident. And it was a bugler or a servant who saved the life of Colonel William Washington at Cowpens. I really won't talk about it much, but it's a great painting. It was done in the 1840s, and it does show the service of African Americans in the war. Now, as far as the segregated regiments, there were only three that served during the war. And this was a Virginia regiment. It was made up of Virginia slaves mostly. This was the earliest. That was called the Loyalist Ethiopian Regiment. It was formed in 1775 with freed slaves, mostly from Virginia, by Royal Governor John Murray Earl Dunmore. The unit was disbanded after 1 year, mostly because it was decimated by smallpox and other diseases during his time down here in Virginia. It's kind of ironic that 6 months after they were disbanded, the British commander-in-chief issued an order to the army that all Negroes, mulattoes, and other improper persons who had been admitted into Loyalist Corps be immediately discharged. So at that point, any Black soldiers who were serving in the Loyalist Corps were basically discharged from those regiments. African Americans did serve in Loyalist military organizations later in the war, and some of them did carry muskets and were in combat. But most of the ones in the established Loyalist regiments were either musicians or servants or wagoners. Now let's get to the next one. In March 1779, the French military formed the Chasseurs Volontaires de Saint-Domingue. It was formed in what later became known as Haiti. The regiment was formed of both free and enslaved Black men, and the enslaved Black men were given their freedom in return for service. Their first action was at the siege of British-held Savannah, Georgia, in autumn 1779, and the unit went on to serve until 1782 or early 1783. Now we'll get back to the Continental Army. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When those words were made public for the Declaration of Independence, Africans had been enslaved in British North America for almost 160 years, and African Americans had been fighting 14 months for the cause of American independence in the Continental Army.
Uh-oh. John, we lost you.
And States Militia. My voice?
Yeah, you're back now. You're good.
Okay. Did my voice keep on going, or?
You left off with 14 months with the Continental Army and state militias.
Okay. Not for another 89 years would slavery in the United States be legally ended. At the onset of the War for Independence, the American population was about 2.1 million. That included approximately 500,000 African Americans, of whom some 450,000 were enslaved. Blacks fought in provincial regiments prior to the war, and roughly 5,000 African American soldiers and sailors, free and slave, served the revolutionary cause. To place the service of those Black Continental soldiers in their proper context, it has to be remembered that at the beginning of our revolution, 90% of African Americans were enslaved. Now, before we go on to early service, let's discuss their motivation for joining and their treatment while serving. The reasons largely mirrored those of their fellow soldiers, the white and Indian soldiers. Many fought for national independence and hoped for opportunities in the new country. Some, perhaps many, joined for the adventure of military service, sometimes connected to the prospect of serving with family or friends. Others were at least partly enticed by the lure of an enlistment bounty or regular pay. Forced service was another factor. If they were on the militia rolls, both white and Black men periodically faced the chance of being drafted for a short-term stint in a Continental Regiment. Whites were occasionally compelled to enlist, but enslaved African Americans were more often coerced or forced by their masters to serve. Many, especially in New England, were promised freedom in return. Most of those promises were kept, but a few veterans were kept in bondage after the war. Of course, the major dividing line between white and Black soldiers, of course, was the American system that enslaved of African American slavery. Now, one remarkable result of my research is finding that Black soldiers largely received the same treatment as their white comrades. And believe me, I looked for any and all instances where they were treated differently, treated poorly, discriminated against. But I found very little evidence. At the most basic level, soldiers of color, and that's both African and Native Americans, received the same pay, provisions, clothing, and equipment as white soldiers. They suffered together in times of scarcity and jointly enjoyed the rare times of bounty. And while early in the war, they seemed to have been given labor details more often than white soldiers, that ended by the war's middle years. Were there difficulties due to officers or fellow soldiers' racial animus? Most surely, but I've found very few. Actually, I found none. and to my knowledge, they were few and far between. Now, one late war incident is telling. A white Rhode Island soldier, Abner Simmons, recalled in 1780 when the two remaining black regiment companies were formed with an integrated Rhode Island levy regiment. Simmons recalled, Captain Elijah Lewis commanded the black company, which was actually two companies, which took post on the right of the levy regiment. Now, the fact that they took post on the right of this integrated levy regiment is noteworthy because according to 18th century military etiquette, the right was the place of honor. And in this case, it was accorded to two segregated black companies. You would not have seen that in the American Civil War, and you would not have seen that in the segregated U.S. Army after that. Now for an early view of their overview of the early service. It has to be remembered that Black Americans were in the fight from the first. Massachusetts militiamen of color, free and enslaved, fought alongside the white comrades on April 19, 1775 at Lexington and Concord. To date, we have the names of 35 Black men present that day, at least 18 seeing combat, and one of them, Prince Estabrook, was wounded with Captain John Parker's company on Lexington Green, which was the first action of the war. It's likely that as many as 40 to 50 African Americans were with the militia on the war's first day. 2 months later, and now I speak of Bunker Hill, which is actually the painting as you see in front of you, and that actually was an enslaved man, Asaba, who fought during the battle. 2 months later at Bunker Hill, at least 88 Black and 15 Indian soldiers are known to have served. One historian estimates the total may have been as high as 150, which was roughly 5% of American troops involved. Now, there are several mentions of Black participation in those early actions, but this is my favorite. Speaking to the courage and resilience of African American soldiers and the effect one man's determination had on another. John Greenwood, who was a white soldier, noted of that day, everywhere the greatest terror and confusion seemed to prevail. As I ran along the road leading to Bunker Hill, it was filled with chairs and wagons, bearing the wounded and dead. Never having beheld such a sight before, I felt very much frightened. I could positively feel my hair stand on end. Just as I came near the place, a Negro man, wounded in the back of his neck, passed me, and his collar being open, and he not having anything on except his shirt and trousers, I saw the wound quite plainly, and the blood running down his back. I asked him if it hurt much. He said no, that he was only going to get a bandage put on it and meant to return. You cannot conceive what encouragement this immediately gave me. I began to feel brave and like a soldier from that moment, and fear never troubled me afterward during the whole war. I just love that quote and how it affected the man who saw that as he went into battle. Now, despite their proven ability, African Americans were early on deemed unfit for continental service. A May 1775 Massachusetts provincial resolution stated that no slaves be admitted into this army upon any consideration whatever. By contrast, in October 1775, Council of Officers agreed unanimously to reject all slaves and by a great majority to reject Negroes altogether. And November 12 Army orders, which would have been given by Washington, directed that neither Negroes, boys unable to bear arms, nor old men unfit to endure the fatigues of the campaign are to be enlisted. Now, during this whole back and forth and all these orders and directives, Black men were in the Army. They were still serving. So all this hubbub really didn't affect them, and it really never did. Signaling a change of policy at the end of December, General Washington told of numbers of free Negroes who were desirous of enlisting, giving leave to the recruiting officers to entertain them. And given the desperate need to fill Continental regiments, that was soon amended to include all free Blacks, and after a while, some slaves, and the American Army began as and remained a racially integrated organization to the war's end. But despite the inclusion and acceptance of African Americans in the ranks and little to no indication of animus from white soldiers, Black Continentals were generally only allowed to serve as musicians or private soldiers, and in the early war years may have been channeled into laboring duties more often than their white comrades. That said, and this is an important statement, that said, Black musket-bearing soldiers fought in every major battle of the war and in most, if not all, of the lesser actions. A number of American officers and congressmen noted the fact of African Americans in the ranks, some unfavorably with the claim they were unsuited to be soldiers, but positive remarks were in the majority. In response to John Adams' October 1775 question about Black soldiers in the Massachusetts regiments, and Adams called them unsuitable for service, General William Heath replied, "There are in the Massachusetts regiments some few lads and old men, and in several regiments some Negroes. Such is also the case with the regiments of the other colonies. Rhode Island has a number of Negroes and Indians. Connecticut has few Negroes, but a number of Indians. The New Hampshire regiments have less of both. The men from Connecticut, I think, in general, are rather stouter than those of either of the other colonies, but the troops of our colony are robust, agile, and as fine fellows in general as I would ever wish to see in the field." And Massachusetts General John Thomas was even more emphatic. "In the regiments at Roxbury, the privates are equal to any that I served with last war. Very few old men, and in the ranks, very few boys. We have some Negroes, but I look on them in general equally serviceable with other men for fatigue and in action. Many of them have proved themselves brave." And foreign officers were also complimentary. In December 1777, a German officer wrote of the American Revolutionary Forces, "The Negro can take the field in his master's place. Hence, you never see a regiment in which there are not a lot of Negroes, and there are well-built, strong, husky fellows among them." And later in the war, Baron Ludwig von Clossen, who was aide-de-camp to the French General Rochambeau, he wrote in July 1781, "I had a chance to see the American Army man for man. It is really painful to see those brave men almost naked with only some trousers and little linen jackets, most of them without stockings, but, would you believe it, very cheerful and healthy in appearance. It is incredible that soldiers composed of men of every age, even children of 15, of whites and blacks, unpaid and rather poorly fed, can march so fast and withstand fire so steadfastly." As for numbers, Clossen claimed, a quarter of Washington's army were Negroes, merry, confident, and sturdy. Now, for his estimate of numbers, I think he overestimates that 25% of the army were African Americans. From my research, it's more likely that numbers did increase, but it was probably closer to 8 to 10%. And we'll see what it was in August 1778. It was actually much less than that, at least in the army. So now we'll take a little bit into numbers, little look at numbers. Not too long, but it is important. In August 1778, a tally was made of the number of Black soldiers in 15 brigades of General George Washington's main army. There were 755 African Americans in a force totaling almost 18,000 rank and file. That means sergeants, corporals, music, and private soldiers. In this return, Black soldiers were 4.2% of the whole. Now, while that proportion may seem small, by themselves, soldiers of color, and again, they're integrated, so they were mixed within the regiments. But if they were formed by themselves into into units, they would have formed 2 understrength regiments, each equal to or larger in size than most other serving Continental regiments. We have to also recall that free Blacks form 2.4% of the overall American population. So even considering some numbers of slaves who may have been in the service at that time, free African Americans were well represented as regards military service. The New Jersey and Rhode Island regiments are not represented on the 1778 return. The number of Blacks serving in the New Jersey's 4 Continental regiments is uncertain, but from my research, it was likely no more than 20 during the entire war. Rhode Island had just reconstituted one of its regiments, the first, filling it with African American and Indian private soldiers, mostly former slaves. In August 1778, that unit contained 147 privates. So if you add those men to the August return, you would have an approximate total of African American soldiers that month to about 916. So we can take these numbers in this return and play with it a bit. Here are the 6 brigades reporting the highest proportions of Black soldiers. We can see that the 3 of them are from the South, 3 of them from the North. The highest proportion was Parsons, Connecticut. That was 9.3%, which is larger than the 4.2% of the Army as a whole. Next, we have Muhlenberg's Virginia, 8.5%, and then down to North Carolina, Patterson's, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Maryland. Now we can play with these numbers a bit more, and we can see what the regiments would have looked like. So each regiment had 8 companies. Parsons, Connecticut would have had an average of 37 black soldiers per regiment. They may have been apportioned between those 8 companies, or they may have been all in one company. We don't know how they were apportioned. And then North Carolina, Patterson's Massachusetts, 22.25. Muhlenberg's Virginia had 19.5 black soldiers per regiment.
Yeah, I'm glad to see Grayson's additional regiment, because that is actually one of the Continental regiments that recruits heavily out of this area. A lot of guys from southern Loudoun County, northern Fauquier County. So
that's interesting to know. I'd love to know how many African Americans were in Grayson's individually, and it may be in the returns if they're still available. And actually talk about, we'll look at an additional regiment now, not Grayson's, unfortunately. Let's see. Yeah, there we are. Okay. Here we have a modern image of a single company of Henley's additional regiment in 1779. And it's courtesy of the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. It's a good representation of how many Continental companies would have appeared during the war, with some having a few more black soldiers than is shown here, and other companies would have had none at all. So to repeat, the proportion of African American soldiers may be considered rather small, but that's not as important as their mere presence in mixed regiments. One reason is the equation of military service with citizenship, a concept that continued into the mid-19th century. And more importantly, foreign observers and others likely considered African Americans serving alongside white soldiers as a radical revolutionary statement, almost on a par with the Declaration of Independence and taking up arms against the King's Army. It may have been an unintentional and to some unwelcome political statement, but it was just as powerful as the purposeful and just as pragmatic arming of blacks during the 1860s American Civil War. Now we'll move on to 2 soldiers' individual stories. And these come from the veterans' 19th century pension narratives, which historian John C. Dan called one of the largest oral history projects ever undertaken. And they are now available. Unfortunately, you have to pay, but they are available online. You can search through them, and they're really, really interesting. And they formed a core for my book. So Jacob Francis was born in New Jersey and eventually served in the Massachusetts Continental Regiment for 1 year, and then in the New Jersey Militia from 1777 from the war to the war's end. Francis was born in January 1754, and he testified that when I was of age, I was bound as an indentured servant, so not a slave, but an indentured servant, by my mother, a colored woman, to one Henry Roundbow in Amwell, New Jersey. His indenture was sold to 3 other masters, and eventually, at a little over 13 years of age, to Joseph Saxton, who took him to New York and then to an island in the Caribbean, and then back to Salem, Massachusetts, where he was sold one more time. In January 1775, his indenture ended, having served his last master for, according to Francis, 6 years and until I was 21 years of age. Now, still living in Salem, Jacob enlisted in autumn 1775 for 1 year in Sergeant's 16th Continental Regiment, belonging to Massachusetts. During that term, he served at the Boston Siege and witnessed the battles of Long Island and White Plains. A short time after the fall of Fort Lee on the New Jersey side of the Hudson River, just across from New York City. Francis and his comrades marched back across New Jersey, crossed the river into Pennsylvania, and then marched down to a camp off from the Delaware River, a few miles below Coriol's Ferry and above Howe's Ferry, where we lay a week or two. The same camp he talks about actually is that's where the Virginia troops camped during that campaign. In his pension application, Jacob really accurately described the 26 December 1776 attack on the Hessians at Trenton. He wrote, and this is in his words, "We received orders to march, and Christmas night crossed at the Delaware River down to Trenton early in the morning. We entered the west end of town. General Washington came into the north end. We marched down the street from the River Road into the town to the corner where it crosses the street running out towards the Scotch Road, and turned up that street. General Washington was at the head of that street coming down towards us, and some of the Hessians were between us, and there we had the fight, and the principal firing was. After about half an hour, the firing ceased. General Lord Sterling rode up to Colonel Sargent, and we were ordered to follow him down through the town toward Assunpink Creek and crossed on to the north side of it. We were formed in line in view of the Hessians who were paraded on the south side. Being hemmed in, the Hessians surrendered, grounded their arms, and left them there and marched down to the old ferry below the Assunpink, where they were ferried across the Delaware River to the Pennsylvania side. Now, Private Francis soon ended his Continental Army career. He was only a Continental soldier for 1 year, or a little bit more. And he was discharged at Trenton pretty soon after the battle. The remainder of Francis's lengthy deposition recounts his militia career, which is too long to recount here. But he did state, "I always went out when it came to my turn to the end of the war, and went out once as a substitute for a person who could not, and gave me $45 Continental money to take his place." Now, there's a postscript to Jacob Francis's story. In 1789, Jacob Francis struck another small blow for freedom. Former slave Phyllis Duncan testified. She was present and saw Mary Francis married to Jacob Francis by Cato Finley. At the time of said marriage, Phyllis and Mary Francis and Cato Finley all lived with and were the slaves of Nathaniel Hunt, where the marriage took place. And that's actually right across the river from where I live right now. Jacob Francis, immediately after his marriage, bought Mary off her master. Mary, in a few days, left the employ of Hunt and went with her husband, and have ever since that time lived together as man and wife up until the death of Jacob, and raised a family of children. So there are a lot of amazing stories like that in the pension papers. You have men saying that they were born on the boat coming over from Africa, that they came across from Africa and by shipboard, and they joined the regiment because they wanted to earn their freedom. So you don't just get a picture of their military service. It can be quite touching sometimes. Now, of all the Black Virginia Continentals found for my study, Andrew Pebbles had perhaps the most varied career. In his pension testimony, and let's see if we can change the image. There we go. In his pension testimony, Pebbles noted he didn't recall the year he enlisted being a poor, unlearned mulatto. But according to my research, the military records show that it was September 1777. He testified that he joined the camp at Valley Forge, and again, this is his own words, and was placed under the command of Captain Lewis Booker, 11th Virginia Regiment, for 2 years. At Trenton, he served 1 year in the artillery. He was under Captain William Miller, 1st Continental Artillery Regiment, who commanded the gun with 12 men to which he belonged. He served for 2 years under Captain Michael Rudolph of Maryland in the light infantry commanded by Colonel Harry Lee. That, of course, is Henry Lee, the father of Robert E. Lee. And Lee's command was composed of infantry and cavalry and called Lee's Legion. Pebbles continues, he was in 3 general actions, at Monmouth, Guilford Courthouse, and at Eutaw Springs. At Eutaw Springs, he received 3 wounds. He was wounded in the shoulder slightly, lost the thumb of his left hand, and was bayoneted in the belly. He was discharged on Combahee River honorably. The day before he was discharged, he was in a battle in which Colonel John Lawrence, who commanded in the absence of Colonel Lee, was killed. And that would have been 27 August 1782. Now, Pebbles, too, though a free man, had to deal with the issue of slavery post-war. In his pension, he testified, by occupation, I'm a miller. From the infirmities of old age, increased by the wounds received in the Revolutionary War, I am not able to render much service to my employer. I am a free mulatto. My wife and child who live at the mill where I do are slaves. My wife's name is Rachel, aged between 50 and 60 years, and my child's name is Ursula, aged 11 years. Now, again, it's just not about military stories and military service. Virginia veterans totaled enslaved family members when they applied for pensions in the early 19th century. Thomas Mahorny was a planter on a little farm, not his, and is rendered unable to pursue it by reason of his age and infirmity. His family residing with him are as follows: his wife Maima and his son Jack, both of which are slaves, he being a free man of color who served in the War of Revolution and is unassisted by the laborer's family. Drury Scott noted, my occupation is that of a rough carpenter, but I can get but little work. And if I had more, I could not do it. My wife is all my family, but being a slave can render me no assistance. So now as promised, I'll turn to the segregated 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which was not segregated during its entire career. The unit most associated with African-American Revolutionary soldiers is often the so-called Black 1st Rhode Island Regiment. In reality, it existed as such only from March 1778 to June 1780, 2 years and 3 months. And it was never large enough to form a full regiment, and because of that, never served with Washington's main army until after the unit was joined with the 2nd Rhode Island in 1781, when they were consolidated into a single Rhode Island regiment. Now, while a detailed discussion would take too much time, I want to have a brief look at events before and soon after the 1st Rhode Island became the only segregated Continental Regiment. Little was certainly known of African-American numbers in the 1775 and 76 Rhode Island regiments, but Massachusetts General William Heath's 1775 letter noted, "The regiments of Rhode Island have a number of Negroes and Indians." So even before the segregated 1st Rhode Island was formed, there were a number of Black soldiers and Indian soldiers in the Rhode Island regiments. And all the Rhode Island regiments from 1775 to through 1777 contained soldiers of color serving alongside their white comrades. With the Continental Army's 1777 rebirth, only the 1st and 2nd Rhode Island regiments remained, recruited with men enlisted or re-enlisted for 3 years or the duration of the war. The Rhode Island regiments were particularly hard hit during the 77 campaign, and the state had to consider how to recruit them. General James Varnum recommended in January 1778 that a battalion of Negroes be raised in Rhode Island. That February, the state legislature resolved that any Negro, mulatto, or Indian man slave in this state may enlist into either of the 2 battalions to serve during the continuance of the war. It was eventually determined that these recruits would join only the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, and that unit would contain only Black or Native American privates with white commissioned officers, sergeants, and corporals. Now, Governor Cook noted in late February, the number of slaves in this state is not great. Of course, Rhode Island is a very small state. But it is generally thought that 300 or upwards will be enlisted. Any slaves accepted received their freedom, and their owners were repaid. Now, the law was unpopular with many residents, and in early May, the legislature set a June 10, 1778 cutoff date for slave recruiting. So after June 10th, 1778, they could accept no more slaves into that regiment, but free Blacks could continue to enlist. Now, despite Governor Cook's assurances, at best less than 150 African Americans ever joined the 1st Regiment, and it was never able to form a full battalion for service with Washington's main army. Now, in those 150 Black soldiers were at least 60 veteran soldiers who served in 77, and a number served in 75 and 76. While the 1st Rhode Island command staff was recruiting slaves in their home state, the regiment's enlisted personnel remained at Valley Forge, and where they were incorporated into the 2nd Regiment. Now, that was only the white soldiers. At the same time, the veteran Black soldiers from both regiments were formed into a single segregated company under Captain Thomas Arnold. Arnold's large company, which was 60 privates by spring 78, belonged to the absent 1st Regiment, but while with the main army fielded with Colonel Israel Angle's 2nd Rhode Island. And now we'll go into a little known story. This is a picture of the Black Regiment, or the Black Company, the portion of the 1st Rhode Island that served at the Battle of Monmouth. And it actually graces the cover of my book too. When Washington's forces confronted the British at June 28, 1778 Battle of Monmouth, Captain Arnold's Black Company marched to Monmouth Courthouse with Varner's brigade in Major General Charles Lee's advance force. Early in the action, Lee's men retreated in the face of superior forces, withdrawing towards Washington's marching troops. Meeting the main army's van, General Lee encountered Washington, who placed Lee in charge of an ad hoc holding action. Lieutenant Colonel Jeremiah Olney described the Rhode Island troops during the ensuing defense, and Olney was present at the action. After retiring something more than a mile, General Varno's brigade was ordered to halt and form by a cross fence to cover 2 pieces of artillery. And if you would go to Monmouth Battlefield today, you could actually find that spot at Monmouth Battlefield. There's a fence marking the site of the hedge fence or hedgerow, and behind that is what's called Oswald's Knoll, and it's a mound, which is where the artillery was formed. So you can actually visit that spot. They were formed to cover 2 pieces of artillery, which were in danger of being lost. We there exchanged about 10 rounds and were then obliged to retire with a considerable loss, but not until the enemy had outflanked us and advanced with charged bayonets to the fence by which we had formed. Our brigade suffered more than any that was engaged. The enemy did not pursue us far in our retreat, observing our army formed on the heights in our rear. Now, the officer that commanded that company, Thomas Arnold, his leg was amputated as a result of that action, the wound he got in action. And one of Arnold's men, Richard Rhodes, related in the 19th century. He's very much crippled in one arm in consequence of a wound received in the Battle of Monmouth. He was born in Africa, brought to this country, and sold as a slave, and enlisted in the Black Regiment to obtain his freedom. Arnold's company joined the 1st Rhode Island in July 1778, and the so-called Black Regiment went on to see combat at the Battle of Rhode Island in August 78. And then remained in their home state until marching into New York to be consolidated with the 2nd Regiment in early 1781. So we'll stick a little bit with the Rhode Islands. Just we're going to get back to numbers now, and we can see the differences in organizations. In October 1777, just after the hard-fought Battle of Red Bank near Philadelphia, the 2 Rhode Island regiments contained 369 musicians and privates, including 65 African-American soldiers. So at that time, Black soldiers amounted to 17.5% of the rank and file strength of those 2 regiments. Now that's almost twice the largest brigade strength on the August 1778 return, which was 9.3%. In August 1778, the regiment contained 137 Black soldiers plus 5 Indians and 4 soldiers with mixed Indian African blood, and during that time they were called mustees. Now, just with that, you can see the makeup of the proportion of Indians to Black soldiers in the regiment. So it was predominantly Black, and you can see that there were mulatto, there were mixed white and African blood, there were mixed Indian African blood. So it was an interesting mix of soldiers remained. At that time, the unit was formed into 2 large companies and attached to an understrength Rhode Island 6th-month levy battalion. Now, in September 1781, having been formed into a single Rhode Island regiment, those 2 large companies, the 2 largest companies in the regiment were the Black companies. So they actually didn't mix the men in with the rest of the companies. They kept those 2 Black companies intact. They were the largest companies in the regiment. They numbered 108 private soldiers. So adding Black musicians and soldiers on other duty, at that date, Black soldiers comprised 29% of the regiment. So you can see how much it grew. Now, the Rhode Island regiments, the numbers of soldiers as a total became smaller, but this, which meant the number of Black soldiers was even larger in the regiment. And just as an aside, this the September 1781 return was made as they were on their way to Yorktown. They were at Head of Elk, Maryland at the time. It also showed that each Black company had 2 women with them. Those women may have had children with them too. We don't know. They weren't on the return, but they did have women with them as they marched south. Now, before we move on, I want to say a bit more about this unit, because it is so well known, and it is really focused on when people talk about African Americans in the Revolution. The segregated First Rhode Island Regiment was an outlier. It was an experiment born of necessity in an army of integrated units. The experiment was largely unsuccessful, but through no fault of its own. The fact that the regiment remained seriously understrength for the entire term of its existence was largely due to the legislature cutting off slave enlistment only 4 months after it was begun. Still, in the 19th century, the Black Regiment became a symbol and example of African-American ability as soldiers and was seen by many as a precursor to the United States colored regiments that were formed during our Civil War. We're actually going to stick with the Rhode Island Regiment for a little bit longer, and it's just because that there's a really interesting story that shows about the different treatment that Blacks did occasionally receive during the war. A late war soldier-civilian confrontation emphasizes the perils Black soldiers were exposed to, even from their fellow revolutionaries. Private Fortune Stoddard began his military career with the integrated Rhode Island 1786 month state battalion. Re-enlisting in the 1781 Rhode Island Regiment that December after the Yorktown siege, he and a number of other Rhode Island soldiers were quartered on the first floor of a home at Head of Elk, Maryland. Upstairs, a group of seamen were celebrating. Inebriated, their captain, James Cunningham, descended to the first floor and commenced abusing the soldiers, particularly Stoddard, who he assaulted with his fists and, quote, a small round chair. Private Stoddard called on the captain to cease. At that point, Connecticut Captain Ebenezer Wales entered and confronted the sea captain, who in turn threatened Wales. The Connecticut captain then had the seamen ousted at the point of the bayonet. That wasn't the end of the story. Cunningham and his men returned the next day and demanded alcohol from the homeowner, which he refused. The sound of breaking furniture drew two unarmed Rhode Islanders upstairs. One was knocked to the floor, and Benjamin Blanchard, a white private, retreated downstairs. Now, so here we can see that Black and white soldiers are billeted or quartered in the same house, so they weren't segregated, even though they were segregated in different companies in that regiment. When the seamen followed him down the stairs, the rest of the soldiers were ready with loaded muskets and fixed bayonets. One white private aimed at Captain Cunningham's chest, but a seaman seized the weapon from the soldier, upon which the captain grabbed it and struck the soldier's head. At this, Private Stoddard fired, hitting Cunningham in the groin, a wound that proved mortal. Fortune Stoddard was arrested and tried for murder in the Cecil County, Maryland Civil Court. He was eventually convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to be branded, specifically burnt in the brawn of the left thumb with a hot iron. That being done, Stoddard was still required to pay court costs, but not having the funds to do so, he remained confined. Finally, the county government settled on the solution that he be sold into slavery to pay his debt. Now, fortunately, the Rhode Island commander brought the case to General Washington, and 8 months after the incident, the Continental Congress decided that the state of Maryland be requested to discharge from confinement Fortune Stoddard, a soldier belonging to the Rhode Island line, confined for costs accrued in late prosecution, and charge such costs to the United States, in order that the same may be charged to the said soldier and deducted out of his pay. Now, we're just going to halt there in Stoddard's story. A similar case occurred in April 1781. Another Rhode Island private soldier, Prince Green, was on nighttime guard duty in Providence when he spotted and challenged someone near his post. Calling for the person to halt and not being complied with, Green fired and killed 23-year-old local resident Edward Allen. Green was arrested by civil authorities and charged with murder. The death of a citizen at the hands of a soldier would have produced a tumult in Providence, but that the soldier was Black and his victim white would likely have added to the uproar. At least we would think so. The trial was held in county court 4 days after the shooting, and Prince Green was convicted of manslaughter. Not murder, but manslaughter. His sentence was to receive an M-shaped brand on his hand and pay all court costs. Somehow Green paid his court costs. Either one of the officers paid it or he paid it himself, because he soon returned to his regiment and served to the end of the war. Now, Fortune Stoddard never reappeared on the regiment's muster rolls, and as far as we know, as late as the end of 1782, he was still in prison, and I think there's records that he was still confined in 1783. We do know that he eventually returned to New York, or returned to Rhode Island and lived in Newport, where he married, raised a family, and by 1805 was working as a chimney sweep. Now, considering both these cases, that both Green's and Stoddard's murder charges resulted in manslaughter convictions that did not require confinement, speaks to some fairness in the jury's deliberations, despite the then common but to us barbaric sentence of branding, and branding was rather common in sentences for both whites and Blacks. The most telling and horrifying result is the Cecil County government's suggestion that Fortune Stoddard be sold into slavery to pay the owed court costs. Beyond any other opinions on the matter, no white soldier could be subjected to the same solution. Now I want to move on to women with the Army and also women on the home front. And there were hundreds, if not in the low thousands, of women and children who were with the Continental Army during the war at different periods. And that included African-American women. So I want to speak of those African-American women who by their own free will or the will of others served with the Army. And many of you might have heard of what people call camp followers. So I want to correct the popular idea of Army women, black and white. They were by and large respectable and respected. Any women who were not long tolerated. I've discovered a number of black women with the Army. Some of them were servants. One of my favorites is Hannah Till. She was a slave. She served in General Washington's military household. She was actually from Massachusetts, so she was actually hired out by her master. The thing is, she was allowed to accrue some of her wages and eventually purchase her freedom. I think in 1779 or early 1780. And she also gave birth to a son at Valley Forge. So if you're ever at Valley Forge and you go to Washington's headquarters, somewhere in that area is probably where she likely gave birth, in either in the house or in an outbuilding. Another woman was Rachel, a slave who stole herself and her son. I know of this from a runaway description. At some point, she ran away from her master, and she joined the 1st Maryland Regiment and stayed there for several months in 1778. At some point, she must have felt threatened, thought that somebody was going to turn her in, so she left that regiment, and that's when the runaway description was given. She was pregnant. Her young son, I think, was 5 years old. They were described as mulatto, and her son had light-colored hair. There's a picture in my book that a friend of mine did for me, and it actually shows her son with blonde hair. Finally we have a good representation of how she may have looked. There we go. But I want to focus on one woman, Judith Lyons, and read the portion of the only known surviving letter written home by a black soldier during the war. And as far as I know, published for the first time in my book. To preface that letter, her husband, John Lyons, enlisted in the 5th Connecticut Regiment in March 1781 for 3 years. Part of his time was spent at West Point and other Hudson Highland posts, so all along the Hudson River. By Judith Lyons' own testimony, they married in 1780. She recalled, "The next summer after I married, he sent for me to come to him. I think the place was called the Highlands. At that time, my husband was a waiter for Colonel Sherman, and while at the camp, I had the smallpox. I think I stayed about 3 or 4 months." Now, Mrs. Lyons noted in the pension application, and that passage just came from the pension application too. So there's some really remarkable information and insights to be found there. But she noted, "My husband used to write to me when he was in the Army, and I have one of his letters now, in which I give to the magistrate who takes this my deposition. It is dated November 11, 1781, and is in the handwriting of my husband." And now just a short portion of the letter. "I take this opportunity to send to you my dear and loving wife, to let you know that I am well and hoping that these my lines may find you and the children well. This is the 6th letter of mine, and I haven't received one. I belong to Colonel Isaac Sherman's regiment, Captain Rice's company. We lay at Fishkill now. I should be very glad if you would send me a letter how you have lived this summer, and whether the house is done, and whether you killed that cow or whether you've got another. I want to know all these things very much. I intend to come home this winter if I can, but I don't know if I can. If I could see myself, then I could talk with you, my dear wife, as I like. I have seen hard times. I have lived 11 days with bread only. I remain your loving husband until death, John Lyons." So this is a remarkable and touching letter. But we can get some insights from it too. First of all, we can see that John Lyons could write. Working with pension applications and also other documents, a lot of white soldiers couldn't write. In the pension applications, you can see that they had to sign an X or make their mark while somebody else wrote their name. By Judith's own testimony, we know that she was with the Army for several months and that she had smallpox. Smallpox is a horrific disease, and if you survive it, which is pretty likely that you wouldn't survive it, but if you survive it, you would have would probably be disfigured with pockmarks on your face. We have no idea, whether she suffered in that way. We also see that she was at home when this letter was written, and she was basically taking care of the household. I've done some more digging and got more information out of the pension files. Judith Lyons was married first for the first time about 5 years before she married John Lyons. She had at least 2 children. Her husband died after 3 years of marriage. So she was at home with at least 2 children, and it mentions children in the letter, and taking care of the cows, taking care of the house. Again, you get to see a little picture of what happened on the home front. Now, I just want to say before I close, John Lyons and Judith Lyons and other veterans returned home to a changed and changing nation. Despite the waning of Northern slavery and the ratification of the 1789 United States Constitution, and boosted by the 1794 cotton gin patent, Black bondage was cemented as a political and economic fact, and detrimental racial attitudes parted before, but more especially after 1800. And I can see this in my research. I can see that during the Revolution, the attitudes towards African Americans was not what it was in 1800, and it was not what it was in the early 19th century. It was not perfect, but it was better. 35 years after the war, Black Revolutionary veterans, along with their white comrades, were eligible for service pensions. But even in that system, they experienced at least some experienced the effect of increasing bias, not all. When all is said and done, African-American military service was a direct challenge to slavery and the racial construct, and an affront to many white citizens. Still, Black Americans continued to fight for their nation. As 81-year-old Judith Lyons related in 1837, "My youngest son died of a wound received in the last war of 1812. His name was Benjamin. The wound was received at the Battle of Chippewa, July 5, 1814. Now, when soldiers applied for their pensions, they had, after the first Pension Act, they had to show that they were in need. So they had to list all their belongings and all their funds, and it was all totaled. So we can see that Black Revolutionary veterans remain proud of their service. And this was attested by Artillo Freeman, who, in a tally of his belongings, because of the pension application, the whole was totaled at $15.75. And at the end of the list, he added one more item, and it was noted to be Revolutionary uniform, invaluable.
This guy's like chills with that. That's
I know,
amazing.
Yeah. And I would love to know what happened. It probably ended in the rag bin, but yeah, but he had it, and he was proud of his service. He was proud, and other African Americans were proud of their service too, and rightfully so. So I actually want to give the last word to a white soldier, and it's where the title of my book comes from. Former Private Henry Hallowell, a white 5th Massachusetts Regiment veteran, gave this simple fitting tribute to African-American soldiers, free and slave, who served the revolutionary cause in a number of roles. And Hallowell wrote, "In my company, there was 4 Negroes named Jephthah Ward, Job Upton, Douglas Middleton, and Pomp Simmons. Part of them called on me after their time was out. They were good soldiers." Thank you.
Thank you, John.
I also have, before we go on, I also have one more thing to share. Actually, I meant to show that. That's a great picture of a 6th Connecticut soldier. And there were a number of African Americans in 6th Connecticut. And if anybody has more interest, I have some resources in the first listed title. I actually started a blog because I've come across more information, and I've had more insights since I published the book. And if you want to email me with questions, that's fine too. So that's my that's the end.
we'll go ahead and we can put those links down in the comments down below the video so that people can follow up. And I know you have a ton of other incredible articles online. So John, tremendous resource. Before I start asking questions, though, we do have some questions from the folks watching.
Sure.
One of the first ones that actually that we got asked was about the Haitian regiment that participated at the Battle of Savannah. I know you showed an image and mentioned them in passing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm not sure who in the French army had the idea to raise that regiment. It was probably somebody serving in Haiti. It could have been even a plantation owner or somebody in the government. And as I said, I don't know if they saw much more heavy combat, but Savannah, Georgia was a pretty hard fought battle, and they saw a lot of action there. I think one of the most interesting things, and I don't know the details, but I know that at least one and probably several soldiers that served in that regiment actually went on to fight in the Haitian Rebellion. And I forget, there's actually one soldier
Henri Christophe, who had served as a young
yeah.
man in the regiment. Supposedly went on to become one of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution.
And if you go down to, I haven't seen it, and I've known about it for a while, but if you go down this, we actually discussed it the other night. We Travis and I had a discussion, an online discussion, and there's a wonderful statue to the regiment down in Savannah, over in Savannah. And from what I understand, it's actually a pretty moving monument.
Yeah, it's a pretty impressive monument.
I just want to mention there's a revolutionary soldier. He was from Connecticut. His name, I think it was Cuff Saunders, and I think he was also called Cuff Wells. And when he served during the war, he served as a hospital steward, and he had experience in mixing medicines, so actually mixed medicines for the hospitals. But his son Prince went to Dartmouth. They actually gave their son at a certain age, probably an early teenager or a teenager, to live with a white man because they were afraid that he would be taken into slavery, that either somebody would steal him, or so that his son went to Dartmouth. His son actually helped set up the education system in Haiti. And then he wrote a 2-volume book on the laws of Haiti. So there you have the revolutionary connection, that the son of a revolutionary veteran actually had some input and some involvement with the beginning of the Haitian nation.
Wow, that is fantastic. We had another question. Says, there are several accounts of soldiers' wives taking their husband's place in the ranks. Any records of this with African American soldiers?
Not that I know of. And the thing is, there's so much we don't know. I mean, there's so many women that served. Women were supposed to, during the battle, they were supposed to stay with the baggage, and the baggage, of course, was kept away from the battle because it had to be protected. Hundreds of women ignored those orders. I've read accounts of women carrying canteens to the soldiers in battle. Of course, there's well-known accounts of women, several accounts of women taking up positions at the artillery pieces. I've never come across any African-American women who did that, but that's not to say that they didn't. Just because, again, there's so much still we don't know that wasn't written down, that was possibly passed down orally, but never was written down.
Yeah, and of course, one of the problems with finding women who served in the ranks disguised as men is if you do a good job, no one's gonna know.
Yeah. I mean, I still think that that women dressing as soldiers was probably rare, very rare during the Revolution. Not like the American Civil War. It was done at least 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 instances. One well-known instance, but I would love to find more. I really would. But again, there were hundreds of men or hundreds of women and children that followed the army during the war. So they at least saw some action. At least the women did at a certain point. They may not have taken up arms, but they were in harm's way.
All right. One other question I see on here is about kind of relating to the Civil War. The role of in the Confederate Army, there are Black men, Blacks who served as servants, attendants, things like that. They may have seen some occasional combat. How does this compare with the way that African Americans are recruited and enlisted? Is there the question says, is there a distinction of ownership in their participation?
There were probably officers who brought slaves into the service. General John Glover from Massachusetts actually he probably collected the bounty. He had 2 slave soldiers serving as soldiers, and because there was a whole series of letter at the end of the war when he was retiring because of ill health, he wanted his men, he wanted his slaves back. Washington wouldn't let him until finally Glover found substitutes to serve in their stead. The joke was on him because by 1790, Massachusetts had no slaves returned on the census, because it's just the way it went. They started having these litigations about freedom. They were called freedom suits, but still it did happen. But on that subject, I devoted an entire appendix in my book to waiters with the Army, and waiters with the Army were both white and black, and as far as I can see, it was equally white and black. And those waiters would have been soldiers. They would have been taken from the ranks to serve as waiters. It was a big thing because Washington was, they were taking men out of the ranks and taking men that could have been in combat. But many did serve, and again, they were both black and white, and probably some Indians as well.
This actually, raises a point that we discussed in the program the other night, but with men being drafted into levies and other ways of getting men into the Army, one of the ways around that was to provide a substitute, and we do know that slave owners would oftentimes allow their enslaved people to be drafted into the Army as a substitute for their own service. And something that we brought up the other night that I wasn't really that familiar with was enslaved people being given as bounties to men who enlisted in the Army. We know that soldiers were offered land and money, things like that. Could you speak on that for just a few minutes?
They tried to do that in Virginia. The legislation was never passed. It just was not a popular act. They did do it in South Carolina, and it finally became legislated, but it was actually put in place by, I think it was Benjamin Huger. It was one of the state or militia generals, because they needed more men. And from my research, there were from this one town, there were a number of mulattoes, citizens who served in the South Carolina regiments, and some of them did take the slave bounty.
So they would have received an enslaved person as a bounty.
Yeah. And we know there were African American slave owners. They were out there, but this was the case where they did take the slave bounty. And again, the Virginia law just never passed.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask just a few questions about the sources that you use. You mentioned these pension records a lot, and the pension records are just this tremendous wealth of information. What other sources did you look at while you were compiling this research?
Well, my biggest conundrum was how to find African American soldiers in the pension papers, because they're not differentiated. I mean, if on the title sheet for the pension papers, it just has the name. Every once in a while, you will say like either colored or Negro or mulatto. Very rarely, so you have to really dig deep. Luckily,
it's not like the Civil War where we could just pull like U.S. colored infantry, and that they're men of color, right?
But luckily, I found I stumbled on, and it's been available for a while. It's called Forgotten Patriots. It's put out by the Daughters of the American Revolution. It was compiled by Eric Grunset and of course a number of others, but he headed the project. And it's all African American and Indian soldiers, and they're all listed by state alphabetically. And alongside their names, it has the sources about where they got their information. Also alongside their names, it notes whether they have a pension, and it gives the pension number. So, and you can, if you access, you can find that online right now. You can download the PDF and put it on your computer and just go through it. So I was able to search it, So if I had men that I knew of and I could just search and find their names. And it's not perfect. I found men on there that had pensions, but it wasn't noted in that. But that, I mean, for a resource that size, that's to be, that's understandable. But it's a great resource. It really is.
Great. Now, if folks want to get a copy of They Were Good Soldiers, what's the best way for them to go about getting a copy?
Well, my U.S. distributor, because it was published in the United Kingdom. So my U.S. distributor is Casemate Publishing. So you can actually just search Casemate Publishing and They Were Good Soldiers, and you can just go on Amazon if you want to too. I'm pretty sure still available on Amazon.
Okay, great. Well, John, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to talk to us. Fascinating talk. Really appreciate the scholarship that has gone into this book. Really sheds a lot of light on a kind of forgotten topic. Hope the folks out there really enjoyed it this evening. Thank you guys for spending some time with us. And I guess the only other note I have is that our programming is not finished for the year. We are going to be having one of our History on Tap programs coming up on December 18th. It's going to be our Christmas on Tap Holiday Spectacular. We will be sharing some kind of fun local stories that took place in and around Christmas. We're going to be inviting some of our past Christmas on Tap guests back. Then there's going to be a few other surprises. So that will be on December 18th. So keep an eye on the Virginia Piedmont Heritage Areas Facebook page. I'd also like to thank the Black History Committee of the Thomas Balch Library for making this event possible, for partnering with us on this. And again, John, I just can't thank you enough for taking the time to be with us tonight.
Well, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right. And how do I make this?